Hey everyone, I'm Tom. I'm the founder and the CEO here at Pinpoint. A real pleasure to meet all of you and to see you all again. I think for those of you that are new to us, Pinpoint's the ATS for multi-stream hiring. I think if you're doing complex hiring across different workforces, teams, geographies, we're typically a pretty fantastic partner for you, and we'd love to hear more about the different hiring challenges you're solving today, especially in this context that we'll talk about today. I think with that in mind, we've also increasingly over the past couple of years, especially become this real consultative partner, holding the hands of a lot of our clients as they kind of go on that AI adoption journey. And we'll spend a bit of time today talking through what we're seeing out there, and hopefully we can all kind of come away with some useful insights. So this is the fourth episode in our relatively new Pinpoint How To Series. I think we've covered a huge amount of ground so far. We've talked about sort of whether you should be using AI as a recruiter and how. We've introduced you to MCPs and talked about why they're useful and maybe some specific context around TA and how to use that and make maximum value. We've talked about how to leverage proper tooling to whittle down huge volumes of applicants to a shortlist super quickly. I think all of those things are things your teams can try now. In today's session, I think the objective is to sort of step back a bit, and you're stuck with me for 20 minutes, and we're going to sort of focus on all of the foundational stuff that underpins all of that and that really makes that stuff sing. I think from my perspective, I think your success with AI adoption is really unlikely, or it's at least sort of very hamstrung if you're not getting the kind of foundational data layer and setting that context properly. And so we'll talk a little about some of the ways you should be thinking about that today. I'm here to basically try and get across that I think when we have conversations with folks, prospects, customers, and sort of everybody in the market, often they've run these experiments across different AI tools, but what they've not seen always is tremendous success. And I think what they'll often do is point at the tools and try and find new tools to fix those problems, when actually the problem sort of lurked beneath that in their data and context layer. And it was about trying to kind of set the scene here today to explain why you should think about that a bit differently. So if we dig in, hopefully everybody can see the presentation and we can transition over to the first slide. I think the argument that we'll make here is that AI is sort of only as good as the context you give it, right? I think when your data is incomplete, you're kind of giving this very fragmented picture of what's happening in TA to your AI. And unsurprisingly, you often will get quite fragmented stuff back. I think we're sort of, if you're starving AI of data, you're kind of robbing yourself of the chance for it to be as useful as possible. And you're actually at risk, in my opinion, of offering experiences worse than the one that you're doing without AI today, because it ends up sort of being muddied and confused and giving you kind of very generic output that I know is much worse than the experience many of you are delivering manually. These are like data and context problems. They're not about tools and applications. I think I'll keep saying that, and I will flag early that we recognize that there's good tools and bad tools, and there's tools that are right for your org and tools that aren't. I'm not diminishing the role that the tool plays, but that to me is a bit of a last mile problem. And actually where we see the vast majority of the pain points at the moment is that they sort of don't have their data in order, and they're not kind of setting themselves up for success long term. So it's also really important to flag that if you sort of hear these things and you feel like, hey, you have got some challenges here and there's a big problem and you're not quite sure how to navigate this, like, you're among friends, right? This is really normal. We see all of this playing out across every function in all of the organizations we work with. I think people, even when they recognize they have an issue, sometimes misappropriate the scale of that problem though, right? I think if you've got lots of hiring workflows, lots of different workforces, you've got lots of tools in your stack, you've got more and more people involved in the recruitment process, like all of these sort of incremental things are leaking context, right? And they're all creating opportunity for the sort of big picture to be missed. Lots and lots of stuff today is happening decision-making wise outside of all of these tools. And I think we're really strongly advocating that we need to recognize the importance of bringing that stuff back into core systems to make sure you've got this sort of unified data layer, right? There's no problem with your hiring managers having a discussion about decision-making outside of the system, or debating candidates over a coffee, or thinking about making informal recommendations and sort of skipping stage. Like, these are all organic things that happen, and we shouldn't pretend that they don't. I think there's a job that we all need to do to work out how to get that data back into the system. And there's ways to make that easy and ways to make it hard. And so we'll talk a little bit about that now. If we move to the next slide, I think, I know that nothing I'm saying so far is super innovative, right? I think I'm not the first person to make these things, but I think it's important to labor the point, because we really want people to see the value in making these investments up front. Because if you get this stuff right, you end up with a tremendously better kind of quality, consistency outcome. And you get this sort of holy grail state of like a self-improving loop where the investments you're making today kind of start spiraling in a positive way over time. So like, here's a sort of real world example to bring this to life a bit. I think if we play out this super common scenario, I'm a hiring manager myself, I'm a leadership figure in a business, I've got a final stage interview with a candidate in 20 minutes time. I've been back to back all day. I've had 10 other interviews this week. I've got a full plate of day job stuff to do that I've not quite got to yet. And I've got a candidate that I'm meeting that I'm supposed to have done loads of research into and read all the notes and reviewed the CV, and I haven't, right? I'm guilty. The reality is that situation is pretty normal, right? We all have hiring managers. We all know those challenges. We should all hopefully empathize with them. I think I'm coming at this wanting to use AI to solve this problem. And this is a sort of example of hiring Copilot within Pinpoint, helping us do that. I think the challenge here, though, is this can go one of two ways, right? If we've done the legwork and we've got our kind of data picture in order, we're going to get a great outcome. If we haven't, we're going to produce this sort of very generic kind of slop stuff, right? Like it's going to be directionally useful and it's going to give you some useful interview questions and some best practices, and it will certainly try its very hardest, but it's going to give you high level stuff. If actually we can give Copilot in this instance, but sort of any of your systems, the context they need, they can take all of the discrete context you can see on the screen, right? Scorecard completions, conversation history, like other candidates in the process, everything that's gone on and the picture that we've built up to this point, and actually really dig in and deliver some value. And the second this starts to happen, people change their behaviors, right? It's the sort of wow moment and the magic that everybody's been promised around AI actually being delivered. And I think like if we take this a little further, this case study example you're seeing on the screen obviously is quite generic, but like I am a real example of this, right? And obviously we unsurprisingly do have our data in order. And I use this flow every day when I recruit, right? Like what I'm going into and talking to Copilot about is, you know, what are the candidates' prior scorecards? What do they look like? Which areas were most disparate? Like which members of my interview panels before I've met this candidate have disagreed strongest on specific parts of this candidate, and go and produce questions for me that help me drill into that. Or, you know, what's the candidate's feedback on our hiring process been like from the transcriptions we have on them? And what questions can I ask them to learn something even more about that? Or what are the big differences between the candidate's current workplace environment and Pinpoint as we see it? And how can I drill into that more? Like, these are all really useful things. And for time poor hiring managers, which to be clear is pretty much every hiring manager, they're really useful. The challenge is if we're not feeding the data into the system, we're not going to get that kind of quality output. And people are going to have these first touch experiences. They're not going to yield great examples and they aren't going to try them again. And so it's not just important that we work on this stuff. It's important that we do it at the right part of the sort of adoption journey too. If we move forward a bit from a science perspective, I think this kind of idea is like better context and whole data beats better tooling and better algorithms every day of the week from our perspective, right? Like this foundational stuff is just not being done. And I think when we look at our own client base and we look at prospects and we look at the data that we see in the market, there's folks at different levels of maturity and very different levels of outcomes. I think the ones that we see that are winning, they're doing that because they're painting this complete picture of their hiring all in one place, right? And they're starting their AI experiments with a clear and kind of pretty comprehensive data picture across that life cycle, or they've put the work in to refine and iterate and sort of plug the gaps in that journey as they go. The sort of outcome of that, though, right, is they start to see this single big clear picture and they start making really, really, really better decisions, right? They're getting AI output that's grounded in actual reality and stuff that actually makes sense for your organization, rather than just sort of generic skills match stuff or stuff that's built and modeled in someone else's data. And you're getting guidance personalized at a much lower level. So if you're kind of not there with your data picture, you might get Copilot conversations or narrative or input that is sort of at the organizational level rather than at the role level or at the candidate level. Sort of the more seeds we're sowing, the kind of more granular and quality the guidance is going to get. I think one of the things that we're seeing really start to rear its head and play a much more pivotal role in the conversation is this idea of like what I'm going to call defensibility, right? But it's this idea that we want to be able to articulate exactly why something happened within the system. And I think we think that's important for two really kind of quite disparate reasons, right? One, we think the best way to learn and iterate and improve the way you're doing anything is to be able to go and debrief properly and understood what happened on that journey and why, and learn from that. And that's hard to do at scale, but AI has all of a sudden made that very feasible. And we'll circle back to some examples there in a bit. I think the other thing, though, is it's really quickly becoming quite a big legal requirement. And I think, some I can recognize some names. Some of you this will matter for more than others today, but I think we're seeing this sort of start to happen and reflect across the market. Things like the EU AI Act, lots of other kind of external regulatory pressure. There's stuff going on in New York and other markets. Like, people are being expected to be able to evidence and talk very transparently about what role is AI playing in the recruitment process of your organization. Candidates are expecting to understand why things have happened to them throughout. And I think even if we don't see this as like a big regulatory burden, candidate expectations exist already, right? And so I think that kind of ratcheting of expectations is only going to continue. And I think making sure you can properly articulate sort of why something happened is going to become increasingly important. I think the thing I'd also say is like the sort of litmus test we try and encourage clients to think about is, again, not from a regulatory reason, but from an actual kind of pure outcome experience optimization stuff is, could somebody who wasn't at all involved in this recruitment process for a candidate accurately depict and explain why you chose to hire or not hire this person based on the stuff they can see in the system? And if you sort of don't feel like that's true of the way that you've architected your process right now, I'd encourage you to address that for a whole bunch of reasons, because there's lots and lots and lots of sort of second order value from being able to articulate that stuff properly. I think the third piece, and the stuff that I get the most excited about, is this idea of like a self-healing or self-improving system, right? It's the stuff that should be giving you all FOMO if you're not getting there yet. And it's this idea that once we've got this kind of complete picture, we can start identifying patterns and trends and insights and start driving behaviors that just previously weren't feasible to analyze or weren't possible to do at scale. And that sort of foundational layer is just so important, right? It allows all of these systems, including ours, to move from a very reactionary system that's sort of taking instruction and spitting stuff back out to you to something that's far more proactive. And I think the rate of evolution in terms of what's happening underneath all of this data is changing rapidly, right? And we can all witness the evolution of these tools. Irrelevant of the tools, that foundational layer needs to exist. So the work we're doing on this stuff now is going to make the future better for all of you if you can actually invest the time in sort of getting that stuff right. And I think a really good example of this that we're seeing at a lot of How To people at the moment is this idea of like a job debrief or a job audit. I think when we look at what's happening in systems, most of the time, once a job is filled, organizations sort of celebrate and go, yeah, that's great, we've won, let's move on to the next thing. And they don't dedicate the time to going back and looking at sort of what happened throughout that journey and learning from that and iterating and improving as a result. I think we get that because everybody's capacity and resource constrained, and we understand that's time intensive. But the beauty of these tools now with the right data is it becomes instantaneous. And what we're seeing at the moment is this really interesting insight pattern emerge from the people who are working on this, where they're saying, show me my intake notes, right? Show me the stuff we gathered through the hiring manager interviews and that sort of early role and rec scoping exercise. And let's dig into what they asked for, right? The hiring manager said this was a non-negotiable. They said this amount of experience was a must-have. They said this was crucial to their selection process. But let's use AI to look at what they told us they cared about and analyze actually what scorecards did they use? How did they talk about things in the transcripts for the interviews that they did? What comments were left against candidates? What did they probe into? What were their sort of selection or rejection reasons? And how did those things differ from the stuff that we heard them say in their intake process? And often what you realize is that we're optimizing for the wrong thing, because what the hiring manager is asking for versus what they're actually selecting on are quite disparate. And again, like doing that exercise at tremendous scale is often very difficult, and having those conversations is often very diplomatically challenging. But when the data's in the system, we can make that really easy, and we can start optimizing automatically, and we can be challenging the hiring manager through the system, and we can be driving performance suggestions, and we can suggest workflow interventions. And like, this is where we think the future of the space is going. But we can't play that role for you and nor can any system if we haven't got the intake notes in the first place, and if we haven't got the transcription, and we haven't got all of the kind of layers of the process so we can track what's actually happening. And like, I'd really encourage you as sort of a practical takeaway to think about doing that exercise on one of your own processes, right? Like, pull up that intake brief for a role that you filled recently, pull up the final scorecard for that role, look at them side by side and identify how different they are, because I think we often see people quite surprised by those deltas, and talk a little internally about what you can learn from that exercise and how valuable it might be to do that at scale across all of your open roles and requisitions. Like, there are a lot of insights there. We want to start driving them for you, as do others in the space, but we can only do that when the data's there and in front of us, right? So if we move to the next slide, I think let's talk about how we can actually get there. I think that there's sort of two fundamental pieces to the puzzle here. They're quite self-explanatory. I think the first one is just make sure that you've got real adoption of the platforms and the technologies that you're using within the business, right? Ultimately, the things that are generating the data and the things that are storing the data is often where the adoption challenge is. People are quite happy to tinker with new tools, but you've got to make sure that the data layer is correct. And what we can't do is bolt these cool sort of sexy new tools on top of a very fragmented process or very fragmented data and expect them to just magically work. That's not going to happen. What I'm not saying, though, just to be clear, is force everybody to use one system in a very explicit way and sort of make kind of friction a compliance problem. Like, we don't mandate that, and it's just unrealistic. We recognize that a lot of work's going to happen inside Claude or OpenAI or ChatGPT. We recognize that a lot of activity is actually happening in Teams or in Slack or equivalents. We're not telling you that that's a bad thing. We're saying make sure that your tools are plugging into those technologies. Use things like MCP that we've talked about in a previous how-to pull that data in and out of those platforms and make sure that those conversational bits that are actually driving decisions are finding their way back into platforms. Because we don't necessarily care where the data originates. We just care that it lands in the right place so AI can see it and learn from it, right? And then I think the second piece is just make sure that you're removing the friction from that process, right? I think, as we've just talked about, mandating system usage doesn't work, so let people do things. I think we often see AI talked about as a feature. I'm sort of very interested in the idea of AI as an interface, right? Like, people are becoming quite au fait at all levels with using these chat interfaces, and MCP connections and some of the stuff, again, that we've talked about in the past really do enable you to get that context back into core systems without forcing people to log into places they wouldn't otherwise be and things like that, right? You need to make sure that your tools and the stuff that you're working with is actually pulling this data into the right place, and that your integration landscape is great. And ideally, your tools are able to offer as kind of much of the bigger picture as possible. A really good example of this, I think, is this idea of a candidate feedback loop, right? So we know how hard it is to get feedback from interviewers. If you're a hiring manager, you'll recognize that this isn't criticism to my earlier point. It's really bloody difficult. And I think, like, again, using myself as an example, I'm often coming into recruitment processes right at the end, doing sort of like solo final stage interviews because I still meet everybody that joins the business today. I want to give that candidate the respect of my full attention, and I struggle to navigate between different screens and sort of start taking notes and doing all these other things when I really just want to be learning as much as I can about the person I'm speaking to. Actually, it's always been a real challenge, right? So the solution is sort of what you're seeing on the screen here as an example, and this is obviously just one slice of your overall recruitment process, but can you be using things like AI Notetaker to just join calls and transcribe stuff automatically? If you're doing that, there's loads of value there, right? One, the feedback's being populated automatically, the scorecards being populated, the scorecards referencing the transcription timestamp so you can see exactly why that was done that way and what context we learned at that part of the puzzle and so on. The other thing is that the manager all of a sudden hasn't got anywhere near as much friction as they used to have. They don't have to remember exactly what was discussed because they're often jumping straight into another meeting. The scorecard's pre-completed. We're asking them to review, check, amend, approve, whatever. But these are 20-second problems or 1-minute problems, not 10 minutes of staring at a blank scorecard that I just don't have the retention for. And so we can streamline that part of the process, but there's also all this second order value hidden underneath, right? Because even if the hiring manager just checks out and they never look at this ever again, we still have the full transcription of everything that happened in that conversation stored safely and securely within the system. And that is still going to feed and impact your hiring decisions and your outcomes, even if you haven't got that kind of manual sanitation on top from the hiring manager. This is one piece of obviously a very, very, very large overarching hiring workflow problem that we all have. But the point is there are tools and approaches and quite simple wins like this for every part of that puzzle today. And it's about prioritizing and making sure that you have a strategy as a TA leader to go in and actually start introducing these things or kind of right-siding these things to give yourself the chance to sort of have that loop fly. And I think, like, we'll get to questions in a second, but sort of preempting some of the stuff we normally see when we talk about this stuff, I think there's often concern around things like transcripts because people are concerned about having all of that data stored securely. They're concerned about the compliance and regulatory overhead of all of those things. I think, like, we recognize that, and those are super important and the correct questions to be asking. I think the way that we look at it is actually not doing these things is the riskier of the two choices today, right? We want that defensibility that the market is increasingly calling for. We want to be able to talk to and evidence why decisions were made the way they were made. And that feels to me to be a much easier conversation to have when it's backed by data, it's backed by proper transcription and all of these things. And I guess, selfishly, that's one of the benefits we see of slightly more mature systems, right? We want access controls and retention policies and audit logs and consent management and like all of this fun stuff that really matters. But it's worth doing the work to get those things because the benefits of this stuff are so outsized in terms of your ability to really, really, really kind of fly. And I think the other question that we'll often get on these sorts of challenges is like, how do we address all of our historical data? Do we need to tidy everything we've ever done up for this to work? And I think, just to be really clear, absolutely not, right? Like, just start whenever you can. And these models and the technology and the tools that we're building and others are building in the marketplace get very good very quickly. You just have to actually start making that flywheel spin a bit. The examples I've given already are things like interview prep and scorecard completion. These work immediately because all they rely on is one candidate's data. And obviously, the more of that you're gathering, the further these tools can go. And so I think as we sort of transition to starting to think about wrapping up and getting to some questions, I'm going to summarize a couple of things you can do this week, and I'll show you some things. What I will say is, like, please do chuck some questions in the chat. I'll go really quickly so we've got time at the end to address any and all of them to the extent we can. But yeah, 3 steps. First one, find the gaps, right? Go through the last few roles in your system, note down everything that's happening where you haven't got that data flowing into the system, and start thinking about where those gaps are in plain sight, right? Are you tracking intake notes? Are you tracking outcomes? And really just note those things down. I think second, prioritize them, right? Which ones matter the most? Which ones are driving decision-making the most? Which ones are easiest to adopt tooling or process changes around? And really think intentionally about incorporating that into your strategy. And I think 3, just go address that and close those gaps, right? Obviously, it's easier to say than do. But I think people sometimes overcomplicate these things, and there's lots of very, very, very easy wins that you could start doing almost immediately that really make a big difference. I think like 2 really simple examples of this are screening decisions, right? At the moment, it's often very difficult for you to work out why you rejected somebody or why you moved them from stage 1 to a second interview, etc. We've seen some clients do some clever things just by putting tags in place or just by using like questions. So when you move a candidate from one stage to another, just ask them to basically evidence why, right? It takes 5 to 10 seconds to just write a small note. But the compounding effect of that narrative immediately has an impact on the ability for these models to work out how to make recommendations that sort of actually suit the way you think about recruitment. And you're kind of giving the AI these muscle memory gains that it needs to be really effective. I think equally, we really encourage organizations to think more about, are you tracking post-hire performance, right? Like, when you've hired Tom, did he do really well in your organization, or actually was he let go very quickly because he was underperforming? If that's the case, we don't want more Toms, we want less Toms. There's lots of very clever ways to do that with 2-way HRIS integrations and things like that, and we support those. But some people just have tags, and every 30 days they'll go back in and just say, hey, did Tom do really well, yes or no? And if he didn't, let's flag that so we don't learn and train on that data. It's like, there are easy wins, and we'd love to talk to you about those. Just to help you on this exercise, I think we've got a bit of a kind of practical template that we'll share via email afterwards. This is obviously just a sort of succinct summary of a hiring workflow. Yours will differ a little bit, but we'll email this to everybody who's in attendance today. Go and populate this. All we're looking for you to do, and you know, this can be an internal thing only if you want, is go through each stage in your process, flag what data you're generating, score the importance of it, and talk about whether that's finding its way into your ATS yet. And if it isn't, start flagging and prioritizing those things and working through sort of the easiest route to get that stuff back in. And again, you have lots of tools at your disposal. Can you do more in the ATS? Can you use MCP to push that stuff back in? Can you use dedicated tooling, and does it integrate nicely? Like, there's lots of answers, but it's really, really worth putting the effort into mapping this out and sort of tracking it over time, because this is the thing that's going to hold you back if you're not getting it right. So to sort of bring us home, I think all AI is actually doing is amplifying what's already there, right? So if you've got fragmented data, you're going to get fragmented output. That's not an AI problem. That's a data problem. Go fix that problem through better adoption, through better tooling, through just essentially making sure that you're actually consciously working on getting that data back into the system. And if you're doing that, I think you're going to make a huge difference. Thank you all for joining. Sincerely appreciate your participation, and we'll be in touch and follow up with some helpful resources and some extra content. Thank you so much.